Ford, and I'm an associate professor of history at Northwest. Though just a week ago, found out I'm full professor.
Whoa!
Thank you. While I'm only able to go to Northwest facilities, and I thought, well, this is the perfect time to work on the Kansas City Hall stuff. And then at the same time, I was invited to contribute an article to a collection or special issue of the Middle West. And I was looking, and that was going to be that issue looking at Black women in the Midwest. And so I offered up a few things, and the one they fit at was the very vague something about women in the Kansas City Call. I don't know what, because I haven't looked yet. And then I went to look. Though, as a note, now doing work in the Kansas City Call is a lot easier because it is now available on newspapers.com. So it's, I think it is, if someone can correct me if that is an incorrect statement, but I think it's now on newspapers.com, so it's a lot more accessible than having to use the one microfilm machine at the university to access it. So if you aren't familiar with it, the Kansas City Call is one of the largest and most successful Black newspapers in the country. It started in 1919. It continues into the in the Kansas City area. So it was frequently paralleled white newspapers in its presentation of women in more traditional roles, and often couched in politics of respectability, right? The kind of respectability that women were supposed to have in this era. So stories throughout the call, as beauty contest winners. They featured a lot of stories about female musicians and actresses in the entertainment section. And obviously women were all over the society and wedding pages. So the call also included a feature, so it's a full page feature called For Women Only, exclamation point, which I love. And this focused on women mostly as wives and mothers, and included like recipes and cleaning tips. And I'll get into some examples of the specifics there in a bit. And so that focus of like For Women Only column, so the other stuff I talked about is like where women work throughout the paper, right? And then we have the For Women Only column. And that focus of like, here's the thing that's just for women, just you ladies, really corresponds with like the prescribed 1950s model of womanhood, and mirrors the presentation of like the ideal womanhood that also is appearing in white newspapers. So there's not anything particularly unique about what's being presented for women in the call. The same thing's going on in other newspapers across the country, both Black and white. Yet, I argue that to present Black women and Black families as middle class in this era really challenged popular conceptions of Blackness in the 1950s. So by depicting like the typical Black woman as a counterpart to the white middle class woman, the Kansas City Call really promotes what I would say is a fairly radical message of racial equality. So it's not a radical message about women, right? It's like, here is you as the ideal woman. But to do so and make the statement about Black women is actually pretty radical for that era. So this presentation of like Black respectability was nothing new. Probably some of y'all know. I think I'm speaking to like an educated audience on this. Black reformers had long used that same tactic, this approach of like using Black respectability as a route to gain racial equality. So in the late 19th century, Booker T. Washington promotes this through the idea of what he calls racial uplift, which is tied to the politics of respectability, meaning through like thrift, industry, hard work, education, but not like super high education, because he was born enslaved in the South, and like a university level education is not the right, but education of a kind. And that by doing those things, then the Black community would raise up themselves, raise up the race, and eventually lead to an expansion of civil rights. Okay, so some of what's going on in the call is tied to like the earlier, like late 19th century, early 20th century ideas of the politics of respectability, even though we're talking like 50 years later. Okay, so men were often the focus of these efforts, and were very much the focus of these efforts by Booker T. Washington. Okay, but Black women soon became leaders of the racial uplift movement, and they also formed their own organizations to support this work. So Black women founded the NACW, which you can see some examples of pieces of NACW things here, in 1896. And that group was focused from its incarnation primarily on uplifting the Black race. And you saw Black women playing a really significant role in this at the turn of the century. One, because you had Black women who said that Black men had failed in achieving racial equality, and so they were going to do it. But also because of the voices of Black men were pretty limited in many ways by the Jim Crow era violence that was targeting Black men. And so like an outspoken, successful Black man could be very easily targeted as this like threatening rapist of white women. And so Black women had a little bit more of an ability to be kind of public and outspoken, though that's not to say they were not ever targeted by violence. They certainly were and could be. And so for these different reasons, Black women increasingly are believing that it was up to them to improve kind of the status of their community and their people. And so the NACW believed that they were responsible for uplifting the race through, quote, intellectual development and cultural refinement. So I mean, this sounds very much like the politics of respectability, right? Cultural refinement, intellectual development. The Missouri branch of the NACW followed those same tenets of the national motto up through the 1950s. So in 1954, the Missouri group promoted three main goals. First, the integration of Missouri public schools, which sounds like intellectual development, but also integration of Missouri public schools, 1954, right? Second, strengthening and improving family life. And third, building a student aid and scholarship fund. So how can they support their own students to then go to these schools and achieve these things that they want? So the Kansas City Call had focused on these same issues of respectability in the early and mid 20th century. So the Call was founded by Chester A. Franklin in 1919. And it was covering, and you can see a lot of this focus on respectability in the way they're covering and talking about like local and regional, especially local and regional events, like what they're choosing to include and how they cover it. So you've got a lot of community and church news, local cultural and activism, and the ways in which they're portraying the Black middle class of Kansas City. And so this presentation really aligns with Franklin. Franklin saw a kind of self-identified meaning that he was interested in approaching civil rights and activism through this concept of racial uplift, okay? And so he used his media platform as this newspaper to counter the white, in part, to counter the white view of Black Kansas City as criminal and immoral. And so those are characteristics that white leaders used in Kansas City and also throughout a lot of the country to justify segregation. And so he sees this paper as a way to counter all of that. So in contrast, Franklin is presenting messages of Black achievement to show positive stories about the Black community. So for instance, in the 1940s, there are a lot of articles in the Call in their entertainment section about Etta Moten, who was based in Chicago at the time, but was from Kansas City. And so the Call was very proud that she was from Kansas City. So she was really portrayed as this icon of the middle class, like someone who the middle class looked up to. And so the Call's articles a lot of times emphasized her national reputation, right? So someone from Chicago's made it, or someone from Kansas City's made it in Chicago. But also, they really emphasized the enthusiasm that white audiences showed her. So that's that idea of like racial uplift, and then that the white community will be forced to see that you have talent and you are equal, right? So it fits into all of those ideas. But then we get to the 1950s. And then in the 1950s, Kansas City is a city in flux. You've got all of the change coming out of World War II and the post-war era. A lot of jobs are increasing, people are moving. The overall population of Kansas City from 1940 to 1950 rose 14%, but the city's black population rose 34%. So that's a lot of change. And that black population also became kind of increasingly transient. And what I mean by that is Kansas City wasn't necessarily the final destination for people. A lot of people might come to Kansas City for a period of time while they're on their way to even bigger hubs in like Chicago or Detroit for post-war work, okay? Additionally, throughout the 1940s, but into the 50s and 60s, the growing black population became increasingly based in older, poor quality housing in the center of the city, while white Kansas City is kind of responded with like, oh no, not this, and are fleeing to newer construction in white suburbs. And what we can also notice in Kansas City is that those housing inequities continued and at times even increased in periods even after you have like legally based discrimination in employment, schools, and housing end, okay? So you've got a lot of things that are happening there. So you've got all of that going on in Kansas City, but then in the 50s, we also have things going on with the Call. Chester Franklin died in 1955, and ownership of the newspaper passed to his widow, Ada Krogman. She was an educator, a reformer, and she encouraged the staff to continue an activist voice that had been developed under the leadership of her husband. But the woman you see on the screen here probably played an even more influential role in shaping the voice of the paper. So Lucille Bluford had been a longtime employee of the paper. She'd started working for them in 1932. And now she was the editor of the paper, and she was the primary journalist. When I say she was like the primary journalist, she wrote like almost everything, okay? So some of the people, I can't imagine who was doing this work, but some of the Kansas City authors like went and counted all the stories that she wrote. And so between 1968 and 1983, of the 358 locally authored news stories that appeared in the Call, she wrote 79% of them. Wow. That's a lot, okay? Additionally, she was really interested in both black rights and in women's rights. And the Call increasingly reported on both of these avenues of civil rights work, criticized very vocally Kansas City political leaders, and encouraged readers to take action when she was doing this. So in those, that 79% of the 358 locally authored stories that she wrote, the majority of them focused on either civil rights or women's rights. And a lot of times they focused on both, okay? And this means then that the readers in Kansas City, but not just Kansas City, but the larger regional circulation of the Call, so by the 50s, the Kansas City Call, even though it was called the Kansas City Call, was the paper for like Missouri, Kansas, but also Colorado, and weirdly Utah and Texas. And so you had like this, a big set of people that are reading this information, that much of it was national, but a lot of it is Kansas City focused and like Midwest focused. So she very much is aligning with the civil rights, black power, and women's liberation movements of the 1960s and 70s. However, that's not 1964, what I'm focused on. And like when you look at a lot of things about the Call, they say that when she kind of took over, that you see this turn in the Call towards like activism, and more radical activism. But what I'm arguing today is that while Franklin was the leader, the Kansas City Call still was presenting a pretty radical message about Black womanhood by being kind of quiet about it, in a sense. So during Franklin's last full year at the helm, that's 1954, while we're looking at that, his paper projected an image of the Black woman striving for the same goals and achieving the same successes as her white middle-class counterparts. And so this presentation of Black women creates a really powerful narrative that does a lot to disrupt what white society deems as being possible for African Americans. That being said, the call doesn't always mention just like positive things, because you've got Franklin who's interested in showing this like positive view of like Black Kansas Cityans, right, for this kind of political purpose. But that's also not the reality for life at the period. And so he is also going to talk about physical violence and discrimination and the hatred that people are facing in those periods. So let me give a couple of examples. So even when you've got Black Kansas Cityans who, I need to stop saying that word in this presentation, it's too tricky. Even when they're able to achieve success, which to be clear was hard, okay? To give you some numbers, you had about 110,000 African Americans in the state of Missouri who were in the workforce in 1950. 60,000 were in service jobs, 23,000 in kind of industrial work, mostly unskilled workers, and 18,000 identified as just common laborers. So very few Black people in the state are able to achieve white-collar work status. Pay was low, unemployment rates were many times higher, like I think we know that. But even the people who are able to achieve that work and those positions are still being limited by segregation and discrimination within Kansas City. So you've got Black Kansas Cityans who are not able to work, live, or spend their leisure time in the same manner as whites in that neighborhood. So for instance, from 1951 to 1953, and if this is on newspapers now, I recommend you look at it, the Call reported regularly on the city's 2-year closure of the pool, the public pool in Swope Park. So rather than integrate the pool, they said, no thanks, we'll just close it, right, to everybody. And only integrate it after this goes through the local and the state courts all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Call also reported on the continued segregation of department store dining, which doesn't sound particularly exciting to a lot of us. But this was really upsetting for middle-class Black women who were able to shop in those stores, but then could not eat in those stores. And then, of course, you also have like much more kind of pernicious tales of racism and discrimination and violence reported nationally from across the country. So you've got like national, kind of like AP wire stories that are included as well. Similarly, the Call did not always focus on respectable Black Kansas City women. So just because Franklin's got this kind of purpose with his paper, he's also going to like include the things that happened. So in 1954, there's kind of this interesting series of articles about the dismissal of a court case that had been filed by a woman who was suing for readmission to Kansas City's Second Baptist Church. So she'd been kicked out of the church because she was supposed to make choir robes for the church, and the church said that she had pocketed the money and not made the robes. So they kicked her out, removed her from the membership rolls, and then she was suing them for readmission to the church. And so the Call is including like these stories of like racial violence, segregation, discrimination, along the stories of Black criminality to show like the full experience of African American life in the U.S. and especially in Kansas City. Of course, I'm talking about women, but I haven't really said much about women other than the woman who's kicked out of church. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. So the paper much more regularly emphasized stories of community success over failure. And we have a lot of emphasis in particular on female beauty and propriety that is really countering the narrative held by white society about Black women. So since the end of the Civil War and slavery, and certainly before then, Black women had faced limitations on their access to claims of true womanhood, right? That you, to be this true woman, right? You're at home and you're pious and you're domestic and like you're all of these things. And they were also like really denigrated for wanting to adopt the role of full-time homemaker. So in a sense, they're kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't, right? So while Black women in many ways couldn't win in the eyes of white society, the Kansas City Call's depiction of Black womanhood in the 1950s and subsequent decades demonstrates how the Black community instead rallied around its women, instead of saying like, no, you can't do this, you can't be a true woman, but also if you have a job, you're making Black men feel bad about themselves, right? Like this is the narrative that's happening out there. So the Call showed Black women to be strong supporters of their families, educated workers, pious examples of Christianity, and symbols of beauty. So let's go ahead and see, I told you it's for women only with like this emphasized. It wouldn't be nearly as fun without the exclamation point at the end of it, I think. The Call really is modeling these ideals for Black women in Kansas City through this For Women Only page, and this is a largely race-neutral page. There's really nothing about race here. It is filled with columns about cooking and home care, okay? So on October 8th, which, let me see, that's not the image you have here. October 8th included recipes for Swiss cheese sauce, savory steak seasoning, and beer-battered fritters, along with recommendations about adding hot bread to the breakfast menu, and accenting chicken and tuna salads with seedless grapes and chopped almonds. The page also featured articles, that same issue, about the care of curtains and where to place silverware on the table. And then oddly gave a very detailed article warning of the risk of kitchen fires and offered firefighting advice to the readers. And as a nod to the power of wives as like post-war consumers, the page also included a short piece on low-cost flooring options that recommended the texture and luster of cheaper options like vinyl plastic, linoleum, or rubber, which they said were better than the more expensive options on the market. The following week's edition is much the same. You've got a combination of recipes. The highlight that week was date sandwich loaves. You've got to remember the 1950s was a special time in terms of culinary taste. And also home care, cleaning tips, needlecraft news, wallpaper design. And like the previous week, the one on the 15th also warned of dangers in the home. This time, recommending closed-toe, rubber-soled shoes to prevent slipping in the kitchen. So these columns are regularly mixing like idealized middle-class luxury. So you've got readers that like, now's the time to enjoy oysters. And like, in Kansas City is ever the time to enjoy oysters? Maybe not, right? But this is like the idealized, right, middle-class luxury. But that's being paired with this more realistic advice for the Black wife and mother. Advice on washing curtains, cleaning slipcovers, purchasing budget flooring to help families survive on a limited budget, which was much more the economic reality for many Black families in Kansas City. So there were other Black Midwestern papers that had similar advice columns like this for women, but the one in the Call was the most extensive and the most detailed. So here are a few examples of the Detroit Tribune. The Omaha Star also had some features for women, but they weren't a full page like this that appeared every week. There also was, I think, a bit of a difference in presentation between the Call and the Star. So the Omaha Star often focused on messages of like racial uplift and advice, which were really about encouraging the Black community to attain middle class status. Like, here's how you can do this. But the call was really just like all the women's columns in like white newspapers, saying you are middle class, right? Here is what you do. This is your reality. So you are already that, or you're already primed to follow the advice. The Star was like priming you to follow the advice, in a sense. The Kansas City Call's representation of Black women elsewhere in its pages also depicted local women as educated, pious, and beautiful members of a respectable and successful middle class. And so so we've got the for women only and what they focus on, but then I want to talk a little bit about those other categories and how you see the call talking about women as educated, then as pious, and then as beautiful. So first, you've got the focus on education. You've got a lot of like marriage announcements and community news items that really specifically highlight the educational achievements and professional positions of women in the Kansas City area. So are these the two I talk about? So Dorothy Boldridge, you see here, she had graduated from Topeka's Washburn College, and this piece notes that she had perfect attendance, and she was now a nurse supervisor in the maternity ward at a hospital in Topeka. There's another example, Harlene Anderson graduated from Missouri's Lincoln University and taught in the Kansas City Public Schools. So you've got this kind of touting of successful local women, and it's also including photographs and announcements featuring young Black women from across the paper's larger circulation region. So a lot of times you have little pieces about women in Texas, especially Texas. There was a lot more news from the Texas people. So there's a story about a young woman from Texas who was going to college to study elementary education. And then there would also be these inclusions about Black women who were breaking the color barrier outside of the newspaper, right? So they're going to specifically highlight Shirley Hughes, who was the first Black woman to enroll at West Virginia University's law school in 1954. So you've got the kind of very local focus, the circulation focus, but then this like the kind of broader country and like notable things in education that are happening by women. You also saw these announcements much more about women than you did about men and in college achievement here. Women also appear regularly in the call for their religious devotion. The paper's church news was often like several pages long, and they usually would feature a different congregation each week, and the congregation wasn't necessarily a Kansas City congregation. It could be from anywhere in the publication area or sometimes anywhere in the country. And so when reporting on these, and this is this church in Denver, like this is a full page of many photographs and a lot of information about what's happening there. So it talks about the church, it talks about the pastor's background, but in this article in particular, there's even more information about his wife than there is about the person who's the pastor. And there's a lot of emphasis on his wife's like educational achievement here. So she graduated from Juilliard, which is amazing, in New York City, and had performed with the Denver Symphony. The paper described her as a lovely lady with an intelligent mind, a quick wit, a glorious smile, and an angelic voice, and said that the church owed its success to her as much as to her husband. And so you see women who are really highlighted and placed as these like central figures in a lot of places that like aren't necessarily about women, right? Or we might not think that are about women. This emphasis on church women may, in part, have resulted from the influential role that Lucille Bluford held at the call. She did a lot of these stories prior to 1955, and like her interest that she had, right? So if she's writing this article, she may have wanted to really highlight the role of women in this. But it also really reflects the important role that women have long played in the Black church community, right? And then I want to talk a little bit about the focus on beauty, and especially like beauty queens and like homecoming queens and things that are in the paper. So in the late 1960s, the Black Power movement, but also the women's liberation movement, like joined together to target beauty pageants as problematic, and both groups addressed the inherent racism of pageants. So in 1968, like we've all heard of like, oh, those bra burning feminists, right? So in 1968, you had this women's liberation protest at the Miss America pageant. No bras were actually burned, so just so you know, that did not happen. They were planning to burn them, but the fire marshal said they couldn't set the trash can on fire. Okay? So that's the part of this that's well known, but they also wrote a whole list about the problems they had with the Miss America pageant. And one of the things they noted was that all the winners had been white, and the very specific kind of exclusion of like Hispanic winners, Black winners, and Indigenous winners. The thing they probably know even less is that the NAACP also protested the pageant that same year. It's just we are familiar more with often the women's liberation one. And the NAACP was also protesting the pageant specifically because of its exclusion of Black women, none of whom had ever made it to the finals at that point in 1968. And so to counter this, the NAACP held the first Miss Black America pageant that year. So that's where that came out of. Additionally, in the 1960s and 70s, right, you've got the refrain "Black is beautiful" that is becoming a lot more well-known. We're talking about this. Rejecting white notions of beauty and encouraging appreciation of dark skin and natural hair. But Black beauty pageants have already had a really long history prior to that point in the US. And you have the Kansas City Call that is highlighting very clearly Black beauty and that Black women were beautiful prior to these kind of larger campaign efforts in the rights movement. So, for instance, the front page of the November 12th edition of the Call that year featured Shirley White, who was the homecoming queen at Lincoln, and the story described her as petite and winsome, but then specifically highlighted her participation in the theater program and in a sorority. So almost always in these focuses on like beauty pageant winners or like homecoming courts, you have an emphasis also on where they're from, but especially on their educational achievements at those institutions and their like social accomplishments. The Call also identified local Black women as figures of beauty and as fashion consumers. You can see some of this over in that page. So in the fall of 1954, you've got several photographs of a fashion review by a local women's club, a Black attorney and civic leader, a woman, narrated the review, which featured, quote, the latest trends in fashion. Another article featured a woman who worked at the Kansas City Art Institute. She was a model herself. She trained other models, right? And so these things, which are appearing as just like, here it is, right, are really helping to legitimize Black beauty standards and Black middle-class women as consumers of fashion, when like simultaneously they're not allowed to have lunch afterwards in the department stores. Like that's a really key thing to note. So in the pages of the Kansas City Call, wives prepared oysters for dinner, apparently, made wallpaper design decisions and laid out silver for elaborate meals. Young women won beauty pageants and were praised for their college success. And devout women served in churches alongside their husbands and garnered respect from their congregations. So stories like this appeared in mainstream white newspapers across the US, where readers saw these women as nothing special, right? They were women who simply aligned with societal prescriptions for the gender in the 1950s. But as I said at the beginning, for a black newspaper to portray such a middle-class image of womanhood as the norm for its readers is significant. Also, when you think about how this paper is being made not just for its black audience, but for a white Kansas City audience, to say this is what black Kansas City is, right? And so the call not only made space for respectable black middle-class women as a role model, but also showed that at least some Kansas City daughters, wives, and mothers were already living this reality. And that's something I think is really notable in the difference here with like the Omaha Star, where it's not you can be this, they already are this, right? And wanting to highlight this. So the call became increasingly outspoken and activist in the 60s and 70s. As I said, other scholars have identified Bluford's leadership after Franklin's death as the person who's really kind of leading that activist charge. And it was more explicitly activist, right? And it was more protest-oriented, and it was saying, like, you, get out there, right, and do this. Not like, you, get those fancy oysters for dinner, right? But, like, there's something about that. And saying, you get out those fancy oysters for dinner, it's saying, no, you're not going to be the way that, like, white leaders say you're going to be, right? You are also this. You have this possibility, and you have this reality. So I would say that the call's depiction of black women's middle-class success in the 1950s had already begun to dismantle the hierarchy of like race-based gender achievement and like recognition in the country. And I think it's a different type of like activist measure that's still pretty interesting and important. So that's most of what I have. Thank you so much. Do you have any questions or any pictures you want me to go back to?
Well, I would like to thank you for pointing out newspapers.com, because growing up in Philadelphia, I was not exposed to the call, but we had the Pittsburgh Courier, the Philadelphia Tribune, the Philadelphia Afro-American, and my father brought in Muhammad Speaks.
Okay.
You know, and so I had all those, as well as Jet Magazine, which really emphasized black beauty. You know, on its
and when did Jet Magazine start?
I'm a child of the 50s, sorry.
Okay. Was it in? It was in the 50s. I just think of it as being so like 1980s. And I don't. Maybe that's just because that's when I was growing up, but I just like that's the image of Jet Magazine I always had.
The big things were Jet Magazine and Ebony.
Yeah.
I'd like to say also, there was a lot of resistance to this black middle class. And Booker T. Washington made his progress because he said, don't worry, we're not going to be studying poetry. We're going to study vocational skills so that black people can be the best servants to you as possible.
Yeah, don't upset the white population.
Exactly.
Right? Well, and that's the whole thing with like Franklin being a self-identified race man. Being a race man was not seen as a positive by a lot of other like more radical black activists, because that was seen as very much kind of conforming to white expectations, right? So yes, definitely.
So we had Marcus Garvey that was talking about uplift and getting the hell out of here, going back to Africa. And Booker T was saying, oh, we can stay, but we'll be nice. We'll behave ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I think with that, you've always got to understand that, like, he was born enslaved in the South. And that is, like, when W.E.B. Du Bois is so critical of Washington, it's like, okay, but, like, you're in Massachusetts. Like, that's not saying these things in Alabama.
The likelihood of getting lynched in Massachusetts is slim.
Yeah. And you had the opportunity to get a PhD, right? Like there's a generational difference, but there's also such a huge like geographic difference too that's there. And yeah, a lot of what's going on in the call is again, it's very much in line for the 1950s and before is very much in line with like Washington's idea of respectability. But I think that's what I think is so interesting about the presentation to women, is because it's not saying be respectable, it's saying they are, right? And that, like, that's different when you've got white society that's like, ick, they're like, those women are oversexed, or they're dominating men, or they have no ability, and it's like, well, actually, all of this is, that's not true, and you've got a lot of other things that are happening.
Maybe Du Bois helped the effort of respectability by identifying the black bourgeoisie. And that's still, within the black community, we still say, you bougie.
Yeah. Long legs. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and on newspapers, they don't have, you don't have the ability in newspapers.com to just search, well, that's not true. If you buy the newspapers.com subscription, you can actually go in and search just the black newspapers. It's not easy from their actual homepage, but if you type in like African American newspapers, newspapers.com, it'll get you to a different search option where you can search specifically there, or they also have a list of like all of the black newspapers that they have digitized, which doesn't mean it's all the black newspapers. That's why here, these images that I had were from, even though I was talking about Omaha, were from Detroit, because at least when I was doing this, the Omaha Star was not digitized, and I think it's still not digitized on newspapers.com, but the that kind of company has recently changed some of its like agreements and how it was doing digitization, or who it was doing them for. So in the last like couple of years, there's been way more papers added, and so if you look today, well, tomorrow or next year, there might be a whole new set of stuff that's online. So it's always good to keep searching.
I'm going to have to go back, because you were talking about how women were portrayed. I missed that.
Yeah.
You know, but I wasn't looking for that.
Yeah.
I'm sure I missed a whole lot of other things reading these newspapers.
Yeah. Yeah, probably as a teenage boy, you're looking at certain, maybe the sport, I don't know. What sections were you focused on?
Well,
do you remember?
I know that the Philadelphia, like the Afro-American and the Tribune, Philadelphia Tribune, had these horrifying pictures of crime, and they photographed corpses.
Yeah.
You know, and I was always kind of shocked and appalled. God, lady. So that stuck out in my mind.
Yeah. And the Call seemed to do that a little less, at least like in the 1950s era, but that also makes sense with like Franklin's intention of the paper, and you've got other paper owners that are wanting to like expose, right, the horrors of violence and racism. So, and I haven't looked at this, but I wonder if maybe some of the northern papers would do that more to show like, hey, this is what's going on in this other part of the country, you need to be aware of it, but like.
But they showed corpses from Philadelphia.
Yeah.
You know, crime victims or whatever.
Yeah.
Do you know how the Kansas City Call was distributed? Like you were saying, like it was all the way down to Texas and Colorado and Kansas, like where, it was a weekly paper.
Yeah.
Like how were they distributing them so far, like down to Texas even? I'm curious. Like that seems like a wide distribution for.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if they were, I mean, I assume they were all getting printed here. There's people who would definitely know this. And I'm sure Call has a lot of their own archives. I'm not totally sure. And I don't have like the exact dates for when like they were including some of those different like states as like, here's our regional kind of efforts. It's also really interesting. I didn't look at this, but I would like to. I think, was it the Call? They would have, I think so, where it was like pages and pages of like reports from like, here's what's up in Buchanan County and like Atchison County, and like it would be all over like Kansas and Missouri, where they'd have a lot of like, they'd have a lot of updates and like, you know, there's the little community news sections that newspapers would have, but for like a pretty big area. Now those would not include like also all the Denver and this, so I don't, it seems like they were sort of like really tangential to what was actually happening in the paper. But like I was really interested in going through and following like all the Buchanan County stuff. It didn't fit into what I was doing for this part of the paper, and it's a big paper. Some of the other Black newspapers were much smaller, and this one is pretty substantial, so there's a lot that's there, and a lot to go through, but I would like to look through some of like those smaller town reporting to see like what's included in them.
It sounds like a really great future research project even for us to look into, go into the Kansas County and Buchanan County and see what we could find about our own Black history there. It might be a really good lead. So that would be good. I think that the Black beauty pageants are very fascinating because they're so complicated, because at the time when they're really emphasizing those, the Black community finds them to be a very empowering Black beauty, because that's what they're pushing. Looking at it from today's standards, how we do beauty pageants and how, it's very objectifying to women. I've had conversations with people in the community and these beauty pageants were amazing. I'm like, but it's still objectifying women, like it's a complicated thing because you're combining this trying to promote Black beauty, but it's an objectifying male gaze of Black beauty.
It had a big negative effect because no women with kinky hair were considered beautiful. Light, bright, and almost white was what sold the day. Tell me something. Did the call appeal to people that played the numbers? And I'm thinking about the Pittsburgh Courier had a comic strip in it, and they had numbers written all through it because people were playing the numbers, which was illegal.
Is it like gambling? Is that like I don't even know what this means.
The lottery?
Yeah. Okay.
Well, before white folks found it lucrative,
Okay.
the Black community had this. It's also called the policy game.
Okay.
And we had racetracks around the country, and the attendance would be printed, and the last 3 digits on the attendance of how many thousands of people were there, that was called the handle.
Yeah.
And the handle for a given day at a given racetrack was the number of the day. So if you managed to guess that number by whatever divination process you came up with, your 10-cent or 25-cent bet, would review a whole lot of money.
Yeah. I don't know, because I was just going through 54 and looking at the stuff about women. So I just was like zeroed in, focused on that. It didn't look at the other, and I'm not even remembering what there was in terms of like comics. I don't remember.
Comic strip.
I don't remember
In
there
the Pittsburgh Courier, there was a comic strip. And the plot was something else, but they had numbers written on hats and on tables and all sorts. It was really weird.
It's making me want to get on the internet and
It
pull
was
up
like a
these numbers
secret
really fast.
language.
Yeah.
Everybody knew what the deal was.
Yeah.
But they didn't come right out and say, this is,
Here's this illegal thing going on.
these are the numbers you ought to play.
Right.
And there were so many numbers, something had to be right.
Yeah. Well, and you also wonder, like, if there was or there was there any change between, like Franklin?
Of course,
at the
because
front
if
versus
you thought you won,
Yeah.
your bookie, the guy that sold you the things, oh no, that was Buchanan County, or that was the number in Atchison.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't like fall in line with like what Chester Franklin's views were.
No.
So I almost think maybe it wouldn't have been, but I have absolutely nothing to base that on other than just like how he seemed to like present himself and his paper.
Yeah, it's a contrast. It appealed to those people that would play the numbers.
Yeah.
And generally, Black bourgeoisie didn't have anything to do with that. It was low class.
Yeah, which is very much what his paper is about and for. So now we all have to get on our newspapers.com account or sign up for it and go look. I feel like I'm being sponsored by newspapers.com.
Hopefully the St. Joe Public Library has a subscription.
We have a subscription.
Oh, you do? Well, hot diggity.
Perfect. Perfect.
Cheap
Yeah.
as I am.
It's so nice because at Northwest there's actually a university subscription that you can get, and so we have the university subscription, which isn't the full, but like our Maryville paper's on there, the St. Joe paper's on there. I don't think the Kansas City Call is on that version, but like the Kansas City Star is, and so my students are able to do a lot of like, okay, well, so what was going on in this time period with in Maryville and in your hometown? Because like a lot of the Lincoln and Omaha papers are there, so they're able to kind of put women's rights or black rights or.
It's always so interesting because like you read those old newspapers and you can learn a lot of history about it, but then I just do because like I'm so regularly in the newspapers and how often I get misquoted or like inaccurately quoted, and I'm like, like how accurate is this history? Because every time I read an article that like presents me, I'm like, I guess that's kind of what I said, but not really.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Well, that's one of the points of the issues, right? Thinking about like, well, what's being said there? Can it be backed up somewhere else? I had a class that was looking at, we're talking about the Tulsa, race massacre, and I said, okay, so now I want you to look at some like black newspapers and some white newspapers on newspapers.com and see how this is being presented and talked about. And one of them found the wildest article that said it blamed the stars. It said like Mercury's in retrograde and Mars is on the yeah, and it made the black population of Tulsa feel too uppity and full of themselves. So it blamed the black population, but it blamed the stars. And I was like, I said to tell them the 1920s was a wild time in terms of like spiritualism.
Well, things haven't changed. I mean, that barge or ship that ran into the pylon on Francis Scott Key Bridge, DEI, you know, it had a crew of color. You know, all these foreigners, and that's what did it. You know, if we didn't have DEI, you know, good white people would not have caused that to happen, or not allowed that to happen.
And maybe it was also the stars, the alignment of the stars. So it's really interesting for them to get to read those newspapers to see like, because there's the way that like we talk about the things as like historians, right? Like we're looking at the broad view or we're taking parts of it, but then when you actually dive into the papers to see, okay, well how many articles were saying this versus saying that, and how were they presenting it? You can get, even if maybe sometimes there's inaccuracies, right, in like what's being presented, or just banana things like the stars did it. It's also telling you what people's mindsets were, and which is I think good to see and interesting for them to see, especially when they're able to find things that like relate to their hometown, right? So like, how was this being talked about like in their hometown? Was it? Yeah.
You know, one tangent you could go on is the role of the black church in progress, because number one, you know, white folks had no influence over the black church. And in fact, it was an offshoot because it was blacks were rejected by white congregations, and so they went their own way. You know, and it was more accepting of women and whatnot. But then there was resistance among black men. There's a book, I think by Richard, it's called Laud Today.
Okay.
And it's all about this black guy feeling very threatened by his wife. You know, she had a job, he had a job, but he wanted to suppress her psychologically. And that spoke volumes about not only did black people receive or experience resistance from the white majority, but also within their own ranks.
Well, and you can see some of that, the way that paper was talking more about the pastor from New Hope, Denver. Like, it was, he's kind of cool, but check out his wife, right? Like, look at her accomplishments, and wow, she's here in Denver, aren't we lucky? So you can see that, who knows if that led to some tension or not, but like, right, you've got that kind of certain information of her.
Well, you know, the pastor's wife, Lady Jones, or whatever the pastor's name was, that was a special category, you know, and still to this day.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then I've got a little survey, if you would like to fill it out for the humidity